Thank you, Robin, and thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and great to have this opportunity to just share a little bit about the experience that poor Fiji had at the time in February of 2016. I'll share my screen if I may. That might be the easiest way. Um, and just right, you can see my slides. Okay, great. Okay, is that a full screen? That's a full screen. Okay,
Mhm.
that's better. Okay, up close and personal. Well, as Robin says, I've traveled a little bit and worked in various places, and I was based in the Pacific for 8 years. So this is personal. And the Pacific is a wonderful place, so hospitable, so welcoming, and I feel as if I've left a little bit of me there. And so part of me is in the Pacific, so it's personal. This is very much personal. Um, but of course, in doing this and giving this perspective from my own experience, I really wish to, I suppose, express deep sympathies for the people who lost their lives during Cyclone Winston and also lost their livelihoods and homes and communities. But I also, I suppose, want to acknowledge and celebrate the resilience of the people of the Pacific. That's the important thing to get across here. Now, I don't know about yourselves in terms of your understanding or experience of the Pacific. If it was anything like mine before I went, it was virtually non-existent. Um, but maybe you saw the film, the Disney film Moana. It was on over Christmas on television. I actually saw it first when it was released, and I saw it actually in Fiji. I think Moana 2 is out now. I haven't seen that one, so I can't recommend that. But I do recommend this film if you've not seen it. But I've put that on because it's the ocean is calling, and that's what I feel. It calls me, and the region calls me. And the ocean is so important to the makeup and identity of the Pacific as well. And as I said, I knew very little about the Pacific before I went. And I ended up going with the Methodist Church as a mission partner. And as Robin says, I was based at the Pacific Conference of Churches mostly for my time there. And what we find is this is the map. Now, I'm a geographer by background, so apologies, you'll have maps. But this was something I had before I went to the Pacific. I actually had a globe on my desk in my previous job facing me with the Pacific Islands looking at me because I didn't have a clue, not a clue where anything was within the region. I knew I was going to go to Fiji, and that was all I knew. And so I had this map. But Fiji is central. It's a hub for the region. But you can see there are literally thousands of different islands that make up the Pacific. And I suppose you could ask, how many islands are there in the Pacific? And I actually don't know. But there are thousands. And people laugh when they say, how many islands are there? Is it high tide or low tide? And it's literally islands appear and disappear. But these islands here, small population, but they've got a very big voice. And they've got a very big voice in terms of climate. And I'll just illustrate this before we actually look at what happened to Fiji. Oh, is it going to work? Woo! Ah, finally. Okay. Um, prior to you may recall the big climate meeting in Paris, oh gosh, 10 years ago now, in 2015. 2 months before that big meeting, the climate change talks, the civil society leaders of the Pacific gathered in Suva, the capital of Fiji, and they met to work out their concerns and their asks, their demands to take to the talks. And they came up with three key points they called red lines. Loss and damage had to be included in any outcome. They wanted to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius pre above pre-industrial levels, and they also wanted decent finance. Those three asks are still on the agenda with us today. And the Pacific leaders were able to take to those negotiations those asks, and they had a very, very big voice, very, very strong presence in those talks. And we're still talking today about 1.5. Whereas we had the strapline 1.5, keep it alive, and that was one of the statements from Glasgow talks of a couple of years ago. The Pacific say 1.5 to stay alive. Very big different emphasis in this. And so it's absolutely central. We're already saying that we're at 1.5. Well, it's going to have devastating consequences, and which is what we'll look at in a moment. The other thing to point out, again, let's hope it works. Yes. Fiji was the very first country to actually ratify the Paris Agreement. May not know that, and I'm pointing that out, one, because of the significance of that, but also the significance of the date. This was just, they signed it and ratified it. It was signed in April of that year. This is February of 2016, a few months after the Paris meeting. But it was a week before Cyclone Winston hit. Just a week before. And at that point, no one realized that it could be the threat and cause the devastation that it actually did. So the first country in the world to ratify the agreement. But even now today, that presence, that voice is so strong because young people in the Pacific, the student movement in the Pacific is at the forefront in leading the campaign for climate justice. And last December, the first couple of weeks of December, the International Court of Justice, the UN's highest world court, isn't it? The International Court of Justice. They heard testimony from over 100 different organizations and states. I think it was 96 different countries made statements to the court. And that's the biggest legal case that's ever been presented. And they were after an opinion, an advisory opinion on states' obligation with regard to climate change. And we're waiting on the results of that. And that could be potentially, revolutionary in terms of being able to get justice for this region and others who are highly vulnerable to climate change. So they've been at the forefront. They're not only at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, but they are at the forefront of seeking justice for people who are affected. And we think of, I went over to the Pacific and was based in the Pacific Conference of Churches as a researcher. I went there with the intention of studying the movement of people in the region, not to do with climate, but in the past because of historic movements, the historic movements of people, to understand what would happen if you actually move people en masse. How does it affect them, their community, their identity? And that was to be, I suppose, past examples, past illustrations of that. But when I got there, it soon became apparent that it was very contemporary. And communities are being moved today because of sea level rise. They're having to relocate. So that's slow onset. But of course, we're talking about these sudden, rapid events. And we get storms, we have storms here, and they're becoming more prevalent and stronger. And likewise in the Pacific, they've always had storms, but they are becoming that little bit stronger. And we need to look at that. Now, not all storms and disturbances will turn into cyclones, thankfully. We need different characteristics, okay? So just a little bit now, you can tell I'm a geographer. Going to have the characteristics of a cyclone, no test at the end, but you need three particular conditions, I suppose. Firstly, you need to have high temperatures, warm seas, in other words. So they've got to be above 26, 27 degrees Celsius. At surface level, at sea level, you also have to have the winds coming together. They've got to meet, converge, and then rise, be forced upwards. And then as they rise upwards through the system, there can't be variation in this wind speed as they go up. So low wind shear, as it's called. Those three conditions are important to actually have the development of a cyclone. And a cyclone rotates, as you know, it rotates as a mass of strong winds, rotates, as you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram, it's a cross-section through a cyclone, and there are bands of rain, heavy squall showers, and then a central column and the eye wall, as you probably all have heard, that calm area before the winds come from a different direction and come again. So there are different sections of a cyclone, and it determines how dangerous it is. Now, in the diagram, you've got the looking down from above, the plan, the direction of movement, plus the rotation of the system. You add both of those together in the red area, the red sector. So in other words, that's where you get the strongest winds, because you've combined the rotational speed and the direction speed as well. Now it says it's navigable semi-circular. I'm not sure I'd want to be at sea in one of these, but it's the area you aim for. You try and move away from, deflect if you do find yourself caught out at sea. I'll come back to that after, when we look at the actual impact of Winston, Cyclone Winston. But a cyclone, I'm using the term cyclone, that's the regional name for this tropical disturbance, this severe tropical disturbance in the southern hemisphere. So in South Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, it's called a cyclone. To the north in the Pacific, it's called a typhoon if you're in the northwest. That impacts Asia. And then it's a hurricane, as we more typically know the term. But also note on that world map, you've got the track, how it moves, a cyclone, but it also shows that there are big gaps in the tropics where there are no cyclones. And that's because you've got the South Pacific on to the east, and you've also got the Atlantic. And both of those are too cold. So they just don't develop in that region. But then you've also got a strip that goes right across the equator, again, where you just don't find hurricanes, cyclones developing. And that's because of the rotation of the Earth is insufficient at that point to actually start that rotation and movement and development. And that, to get the curvature and the rotation movement of a cyclone, is called the Coriolis force or Coriolis effect. I think it was Coriolis was a French mathematician from the 19th century. And he noticed, and hopefully you can see they don't quite mirror, but the actual movement track of a cyclone typically is opposite in each direction. So it starts at the equator and moves northwards in the northern hemisphere, moves southwards with curvature in the southern hemisphere. Pointing that out, because we'll look at Winston in a minute, the actual distribution of that. Talked of climate change already. What's going to happen with cyclones? Well, it's predicted that the actual number of them will be less. We won't get as many. There'll be fewer cyclones, but the intensity will increase. All right, that's the prediction with climate change. And obviously, as we've had a warming of the season and our planet over the last couple of decades, you can ask, has that been apparent already? And it's rather difficult to say that because the actual occurrence of cyclones, there's been too few of them, and the records go back too short a time to actually have a definite trend. But you can see there, from the 1980s, obviously you've got lived experience before the 1980s, but in the 1980s, we have scientific records, data, in other words. You can actually got recordings of wind strength. And you can see that there has been a gradual increase in time. But to date, there's been 23 since records began. Obviously, there's been before, but for our knowledge of actual impact and intensity. So maybe we can see, maybe they are becoming more frequent. But now that looks idyllic, doesn't it? But you can also see here, the Pacific is a mass region of very small islands. And so if you've got a cyclone, a really intense, severe tropical cyclone, it may not impact a country. Some are more vulnerable than others. Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, certainly will experience them. New Caledonia experience cyclones. And in fact, because of the scale of islands and scale of the ocean itself, of those 23 cyclones that are category 5, only 4 have actually made landfall. And that's important to realize. And why I say that is because the first of those 4 cyclones was the year before. In 2015, Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu hit Vanuatu in March of that year, caused absolute devastation and went right through the capital and over islands that totally decimated the populations there. And that was actually attributed by the president at the time to climate change, bold enough to actually make that statement. And so that was the first experience that the region had had of a category 5 cyclone, just the year before, to make landfall. They'd had others, severe cyclones, but not a category 5. So let's look at this. We're here category 5, but obviously it goes from 1 to 5. For category 5 is the most severe. And you can see here, sustained winds of in excess of 123 miles per hour. Sustained winds. Wind gusts of 174 miles per hour. And something that many people don't realize that accompanies a cyclone when it makes landfall is that there's a storm surge. Because of the low pressure, it sucks up the surface of the ocean, and that then travels inland as it actually hits the coast. So it's referred to as a storm surge, and that is in excess of 5.5 meters. And you can imagine it just obliterates anything. That's the category. And this is what Winston was. Sustained winds of 175, 10-minute sustained winds of 175 miles an hour. 1 minute sustained winds of 180 and 190 mile an hour gust. That's the highest ever recorded. And a storm surge of 12 meters. Unimaginable. Unimaginable for an island community where most people live around the coast. So you can see that there would be devastation. And people did not realize, certainly, about the storm surge. And I'll put it in context. We in South Wales were affected by Storm Dara in December. And we had the excessive wind speed of about 70 miles an hour in Cardiff. Just think of the difference. I don't think we can't imagine. We can't imagine if you don't live in and experience that. Just to show you the difference. Okay, the path of Cyclone Winston. Cyclone Winston was not only the most severe, it was the most baffling of cyclones. They are a little bit erratic. There is a general trend from the equator moving south in a curvature. However, Cyclone Winston played with the region for over 2 weeks. It started off, and hopefully you can follow the actual, it's not the clearest of maps, but you can start off with the blue to the north, to the top of the actual image, and it trundles down in dots going south, and it loops around and heads out to the east. And that would be a typical path. That was what you'd expect, and you'd expect it therefore to just disappear. That's fine. It's off the radar. We don't have to worry. And what actually happened was Cyclone Winston, at that point furthest east, stopped. It was stationary for 2 whole days. And that is unheard of. Baffling, absolutely baffling. And unfortunately, what was happening was those 2 days of stationary position, it gained strength and energy from the warm ocean. And then it did something else that we're just totally unaware of it could do. It reversed, it came back on itself. And so people were not aware, they weren't expecting it to arrive. And in fact, I was actually in UN OCHA for a meeting for something else, and I stayed back on the Thursday. February the 20th, it hit Fiji, and that was a Saturday. Thursday afternoon, day and a half before, I was in the OCHA office, the Office of Humanitarian Affairs in Fiji, and they were having a situational meeting with all the different humanitarian representatives coming together. And at that point, there was a person from OCHA with a plane ticket for the next morning to go to Tonga, because the cyclone was going to go to Tonga. That's what we were expecting, and they had to cancel, obviously. And it came back at us. And at one point, it was aimed, they actually projected it would hit the capital, Suva. And we had to prepare for that. That was Friday. We were expecting it to come and hit us on the Saturday. And it went further north. And it went further north, right across the islands. You can just hopefully see the 2 main islands of Fiji, Viti Levu to the south and Vanuatu Levu to the north. And it went right through Blythe Waters cut across between the 2 as a Category 5. And then trailed off in subsequent days and went off towards Australia. Unbelievable track. We were all caught out. And I went to bed on the Friday, not knowing whether we were going to get a Category 5 directly over the head on top of us. So it caught us out. And I was in Suva, so I wasn't in the direct path. And we were very thankful that it didn't hit the capital, because then the agencies could respond. Because if it had gone over where everyone was settling and ready to act, then there would have been devastation. I actually moved from my accommodation. I'll show you my accommodation shortly. I moved from my accommodation and went to stay with someone else who was in the capital, in the city centre, because their property was more secure than mine. And at that point, you may or may not be able to tell, those coconut trees are literally almost inside out. They're blown inside out. And that was the wind intensity in Suva, and that was outside of the devastation zone. We lost all electricity and communication. So that was taken at getting on for the height of the storm in Suva, which is a wind speed greater than Britain or Ireland or anywhere else in this area has experienced. But we were out of the devastation. And we were told there was a curfew, a national curfew. And the national curfew went from Saturday afternoon when it hit, right, well, 6 o'clock you can see there, right the way through till the following Monday. People were not allowed to move for people's safety before they could assess what was happening.
Yeah, right.
And the next morning, this is where I was staying, there was quite a bit of damage. And I was close enough because I was in the city centre. I was the person with the instruction to go and check the office. So I had permission to go out and just walk to the office, which was maybe 7-8 minutes walk away. and that's all I could do. But you had to be really careful in doing that. But you weren't able to move en masse until the Monday. And on the Monday, um, I was able to go back to my own property and see what had been happening. But as I said, we were out of the danger. We were out of danger. We were able to respond to those in need as a result. But hopefully you can see on the left-hand side there, you can see that there's wires, everything's down, and you were literally tripping over live wires. You had to be so careful walking through anything. And you can see the size of the tree on the right-hand side that had fallen. So this is the impact outside of the danger zone. When news came of the actual impact in the danger zone, it was, well, heartbreaking. And remember, I said the track, the really dangerous part, and in this case, it would be to the south of that solid red line with the arrows on it. And it went right across the northern part of the main island of Fiji, Viti level. Suva, incidentally, is just on the coast above the word central. So we were out of the danger zone. But right across, there was absolute devastation. 60% of the population had been affected severely. You know, and if you compare that to what we have here in Britain, what that's almost about 40 million people equivalent. So it was heartbreaking to see. And when the actual images came in, I didn't go out into the communities. We were told not to. This was important that the organized agents had to do the relief effort away from the capital. And that is really difficult for Fijians who are family orientated and extended families throughout the islands to be told that they had the resources, they weren't affected in the capital, they had things to share, and yet they themselves able to go out and access the communities. They had to wait for it to be organized. And that was really very, very difficult for people. And you can see, that danger again, where the impact would be. And that is the impact. That is a Category 5 cyclone. There is quite literally nothing left. And these are the first images that came in. Power was lost. We lost power. In the capital, we didn't have any power, but it did come back after a day or so. But some places didn't have it for weeks and weeks. There was no communication whatsoever with the second biggest island. And these are the images that came back. And that was someone who lived in one of the Tavayuni, and they had a home there, and it had just exploded. And so the result of Cyclone Winston, there were 44 deaths. Now, 44 deaths, you say, well, thankfully, maybe only 44 deaths. Again, if we compared it to, say, the population of Britain, that would be in excess of 3,000 people who were killed. Most of them were indigenous Fijians, Itoke, who are communities who would live around the coast and communities, fishing communities. And a high percentage, unfortunately, were overrepresented were those who were 65 years or older. And as a financial hit for the country, it was over £1 billion. That's something we can't even imagine. But more than that, it was the trauma of having lived through it. One particular island, I mean, you can actually maybe afterwards look to see there's coverage of this online. Some of the images are absolutely heartbreaking. Koro Island, there were 14 villages on Koro Island that had the full impact of Cyclone Winston. There wasn't a single building that wasn't badly destroyed or quite literally obliterated. And then the cyclone carried on across northern Fiji. And that's the location of it. You can see where it would be in its path. How did we respond? We, as I said, were based in the capital that wasn't that badly affected. We weren't, we didn't have homes that were damaged. We didn't have resources that were damaged. We were church. I was based at the Pacific Conference of Churches, and obviously our remit was to be concerned about all communities. And we were able to gather all the different denominations in Fiji who were represented through the agent and come together to actually undertake our own, I suppose, situational reports and be able to reach out to communities. Because unlike anywhere else that I've really lived or been in that sense, church was so influential to the people, such a place of reassurance and somewhere where they would go and seek advice and help. And so churches and church leaders were able to be to offer reassurance and comfort at the time. So we were able to do that in parallel with other NGOs that were operational, but also to enable, I suppose, to make sure that there was a presence, a comforting presence by church leaders at the time of most need. But there was also for them to be aware of the trauma that people had lived through and psychological first aid, just being aware of that. And they even brought in a gentleman there, you can see, a disaster specialist, how to respond to the situation. And so we were able to respond in our own unique way as faith communities to the situation itself, whilst others, Fiji Red Cross, and obviously the UN agencies there, were able to be operational in terms of situational updates and response. And the response, as you can see, I think it was just under 500 schools were closed, affected. And that is the first point you want to go to for comforting of children, especially when they don't have that security of routine of going to school, having that education. There were so many tarpaulin tents, homes, and schools popping up everywhere. So they actually had Bainimarama, the Prime Minister at the time, was launched an adopt a school strategy. So for overseas aid, they could actually sponsor a school and start to rebuild, basically. Questionable headlines maybe on the other side in terms of the newspaper, but that was their response in terms of how do we address this. 60,000 houses were destroyed and needing to be rebuilt. And of course, you think it's not just the house needs to be rebuilt, but how do you get the resources to it? Many of these are remote communities. So it wasn't just a case of, okay, let's start again, but how to do that. Mm-hmm. And then you had the stories after it. And Vara is, and still is, the president of the Market Vendors Association in Raki Raki, one of the northern towns in the main island of Fiji. And she was describing how children, when it was heavy rain and wind, they'd still run in and say, hurricane's coming, hurricane's coming. So it's the psychological damage that there was tremendous, aside from livelihoods and lives that were lost. And they had the strap lines stronger than Winston. And I've credited the Pacific people and the Fijian people with this resilience, this strength. And they were, and they acted and rallied around. And it's live to tell. And the stories you heard of children being wrapped in banana leaf mats and put under houses or put into kitchen cupboards, or ways of surviving and being able to retell were phenomenal. And it's preparing for the unknown, though, because as I said, it was only the second cyclone to hit landfall in the Pacific. And these are the headlines. This is just an observation because we didn't know what to prepare for en masse. Now, this is the newspaper. Obviously, it wasn't so much social media, but it was newspaper print, very important at the time, still to communities, island communities there. Fiji Sun had this as a headline. There are two newspapers in Fiji. This was the government-focused one, and it said Winston will hit us. And then the other popular newspaper is the Fiji Times. And this is the headline. Well, this is the front page from the day that Cyclone Winston hit. And that is the level of not necessarily being aware of what could actually come. Because people hadn't, this was outside of their experience. And in fact, immediately after any disaster, you have a post-disaster needs assessment, an immediate needs assessment. And their comment, direct link from that, was public understanding of the characteristics of a Category 5 system and its associated risks was a huge challenge. It was a huge challenge because no one had actually had that before. They didn't know what to expect. They couldn't imagine those wind strengths and what they would do. And the warnings weren't there because they didn't have any legacy. They didn't know what was to come. And it was interesting that most people didn't know. And this gentleman was a market vendor in Savu Savu market in the other island, the northern island of Vanuatu. And he'd gone to market on Saturday morning. He'd heard about the warnings and he knew there was something coming, but he didn't bother until his daughter in Australia phoned him and said, "Dad, go home. Dad, go home. I can see that there's a cyclone coming." And he'd responded and done that. Another vendor said, "Yes, but I knew it was going to be severe because I'd seen on YouTube what Cyclone Pam had done to Vanuatu. So I instructed my children to empty their school bags of their school books and things like that and put in there tinned fish, tuna, dried biscuits, and 2 changes of clothes because I knew what was coming because I'd seen it on YouTube." Most people, though, didn't. Most people didn't know it was coming, and it came with such ferocity and out as you could see from the track, so unexpectedly. We live in an age now where we have information overload almost, and many of us maybe would have received the notification of Storm Dara. And thankfully that didn't reach its full potential, but nevertheless it was pretty severe. But we're notified immediately. And it's interesting, the difference in time, yes, because we've got moved on. We've all got smartphones now and can be notified. But also the difference of understanding in terms of we'd experienced storms before. We knew what could come. Now, I hadn't experienced a storm before, but I knew what potentially could come. And this is my property. It's the one with all the sticky tape all over the windows. The Friday afternoon before Cyclone Winston, I spent the entire afternoon preparing all the windows because they shatter and explode and you get splinters of glass everywhere. And also preparing everything inside. All my clothes were put in holdalls and they were put in the center of my living space. And then heavy furniture was put on top because if the roof went, I would hope that everything would remain intact. Very, very few people thought to prepare to any length and extent because they weren't aware. They just weren't aware. And so the only other example I could find of any level of preparation in Suva, beyond the tidy up the garden sort of thing, was this example. Alliance Française, which is the French language school in Suva, they boarded up their windows in expectation. Most people hadn't. So thankfully it didn't go through the capital, but it did severely hit the north. So we're not prepared, mostly. I mean, this is an example. That's my where I went to stay. I went to stay with someone. They were only there temporarily in Fiji as a consultant, and thought it best if I was there to know if things did go badly, but also to be two people together. And this is what we did. We filled absolutely everything with water, and we had dried food. And one of my memories of the evening of Cyclone Winston, we had no electricity, and she remembered she had a load of fish in the freezer. So we spent the evening with head torches trying to descale and gut fish, which makes a mess, I can assure you. But it's that level of preparedness. And it's a level of preparedness that only comes with knowledge and understanding. Or, and I'll show you this example. I went home. This is my property. That's the kitchen window. You've got it's seen better days. But as I opened the kitchen window when I got back to my property to ventilate the place, there was a colony of red ants that had come up into the crevice. And not only had they come up into the crevice, they'd taken leaves with them. Now, I don't know if that was for shelter or for food source. I just don't know. But they'd known what was coming. They knew to get up high and to get to safety. Whatever we do to our planet, certain things will survive and be carry on regardless, in a hopeful manner. And by the time I'd run to get my camera, because I didn't have a smartphone at the time, many of them had dispersed. So this is the remnants of them. But it was something I've never seen before nor since, an understanding of our natural world by nature, and something to really think about there. And then just quickly, as a recovery, I've mentioned a few market vendors. That was because I was very fortunate. After being based at the Pacific Conference of Churches, I moved on to work to do a consultancy for the UN Women in market vendors. And whilst they were being upskilled and empowered at a financial and awareness business level, they were also in need of vulnerability assessments for their markets, the actual buildings that they were using, because many of them had been obliterated. And so there's a piece of work for Fiji, Solomons, and Vanuatu that looked at the infrastructure that they used. And now many of them have been upgraded. So Vara, who you saw as a person, the president of the Market Vendor Association, has now got a fantastic new Category 5 resilient market. And they are safe and they are secure. And that was in 2020. Well, earlier this year, they had Levuka has now got a new market as well. And they're slowly upgrading these markets. So there was build back better, build back safer. And that's so important. It shows the resilience of these people who are able to do that. And it's not just that, it's also, now we arranged this to do this talk, months ago now. And I was very conscious of the fact that we were going to go right through a cyclone season before I was able to relay the story and experiences of this. And in fact, this was a Category 2 cyclone that went over Fiji on the weekend. It went, again, they're becoming much more aware, aren't they, in terms of actually media coverage now. And these are taken various snapshots from either the paper or from my phone, just to show you. Not always the best in terms of graphics, but I don't know how you depict the passage or the path of a cyclone. But it's being aware that people were going to be vulnerable. There was adverse weather coming. It was going to bring heavy rain, strong winds, and flooding today. Thankfully, the path missed most of the highly populated parts of Fiji. And then they demonstrated that it was tracking off to the south and weakening. So it's much, much more improved in terms of awareness now. People are fully aware and really act and prepare when there is a cyclone, which is so reassuring, I think. And then preparing for the unknown. I don't know, bring it back to us because Fiji's a long way away. I don't know. There are lots of different surveys, and it's in the news all the time. Even today, we've had the climate change committee, um, and you've got people are worried. Most people are worried in this country. Some are very, very worried. A third of people who say they're worried, really worried, and think that it will harm them. But how do we communicate what we don't know? How do we prepare for what we don't know? How do we encourage people to adapt to what's not known and to mitigate, to change behavior for something that we don't know what's the future's going to hold? I don't know. Maybe that's something for us all to think about. But I'll just leave you lastly with a couple of images. The region does leave a mark on me, but it does lead in terms of climate justice. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.